Thank you. Welcome everybody to another Wednesday Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series webinar. We're talking about redhorse today, really a fascinating fish. We've kind of been called rough fish in the past, something that's kind of fun to get out there and catch. And we have two presenters today. Devon is going to talk kind of on the research side of it, and Corey's going to join us to talk a little bit more on the fishing part of it. What's, how to catch these fish and some of the spectacular things you can do once you catch a fish. So I think with that, Devon, I'll turn it over to you and let you get started.
Cool, thank you. While the title of this talk was originally Minnesota Redhorse, I think a better way of putting it would be Reviving the Underdog, Redhorse Conservation and Management for Forgotten Legacy. I can impart nothing during this talk other than what I'm about to say here is that this isn't, and love of these fish isn't new. It was just kind of forgotten, lost for a little while. And I think it's something as a culture we're kind of rediscovering currently. A little about me, I got my start in fisheries in Western New York, growing up fishing on trout and accidentally catching white suckers and fall fish, another type of catastoma. Really found that I almost enjoyed catching them more due to their, quite often superior fight on a line. After which I got my undergrad in New York, went and did my master's in Louisiana State University, where I worked on southeastern blue suckers, which is similar to species we have here called the blue sucker, which is an endemic river species. So it's, lives in the river, and it's in the US only. And they look like torpedoes of muscle. Basically, if you could picture a fish that looks like it should be a powerful river fish, the blue sucker's your species. After that, I got my PhD at Southern Illinois University, where I worked on mostly on catfish, but I worked on some suckers and cyprinids, mostly invasives. Worked for Arizona Game and Fish, where I did some sucker work there as well as some other game fish, particularly gila trout and some other trout. And now I'm here in Minnesota working as a researcher, working on native species such as redhorse, paddlefish, gar, buffalo, and some others. So to get into today's talk, what I'm going to kind of discuss is give you an introduction of what a catastoma is, or a sucker fish, the sucker family. We're going to talk about the shift in conservation paradigm. I'll give you a little introduction to redhorse, spotlight two of them because I could, I'd be here all day if I wanted to talk about all the species we have. And then highlight a little bit of the research I'm doing, kind of leave you with a little bit of sciencey knowledge at the end beyond just a kind of the history lesson. So, introduction to catastoma. The sucker family is characterized by a downturned mouth. Translates the name catastoma, translates to root mouth essentially. So downward facing mouth. They feed on the benthos typically. Inverts such as insects, plankton, that are on gravel and woody debris in the river or streams. They're the third largest group of fish in North America, behind the minnow families and the darters and dace family, which are small-bodied, colorful little individuals. Suckers are unique to North America. Unlike a lot of fish you might catch, walleye, bass, trout, the U.S. is pretty much the go-to spot for these fish. You can't really get these or can't fish from other countries. They are invasive in some other countries. But, as far as what you can catch as a future game fish or sport fish, this is a unique North American, group of fish. The other aspect of this family is they're generally in town of poor water quality. They're considered ecological indicators. If you see declines in suckers, and it's not due to harvest, is likely due to environmental issues you're having. And you start seeing those cascades through other more tolerant species like walleye and bass after the redhorse and other suckers kind of decline. Threat to catastoma. Currently, popularity as a sport fish is growing. While this alone as a singular stressor is unlikely to cause very large dramatic populations, generally low relative to other species. This may compound with other stressors and have a larger negative impact on sucker population sustainability than any individual stressor alone. So it's not just, say, dams or poor water quality. It's the coupling of dams, poor water quality, harvest pressure, all combined into one, kind of have like a multiplication effect rather than an additive effect. on these populations. So you see a quicker and quicker decline as you add more and more stressors onto these populations. As you know, we live in an area that is highly dammed. These fish are highly migratory. Quite often they have homing tendencies. Many species, I'm going to go back here, many species will make movements of 300 to 400 kilometers. Things like the blue sucker will move 300 kilometers in a couple weeks, going from one bend in a river up to a specific log jam, moving back downriver to that same bar and doing that year after year after year, which is quite interesting as far as like fisheries dynamics and being a fish nerd personally. I think that's super interesting that this fish knows exactly where to go 300 kilometers away. But what happens when you start putting dams all along a river like the Mississippi? It becomes a little bit problematic to get to those reaches, and it causes issues for spawning behavior, especially as I just mentioned, when those fish home to specific spots. They're still going to try to get back to those spots. And then you have something like this in this picture here. It becomes quite improbable for many of them to make that passage. As far as conservation goes, they generally lack constituency groups that advocate for their conservation and can often remain overlooked relative to their sport fish counterparts. This is changing. There are groups like the Eisen-Walton League, Rough Fish for Tomorrow. There are other groups that are emerging that are really trying to push for sucker conservation and management of these species. Add on to that, 35% of these species of the whole sucker family are either threatened, endangered, or of special concern, with 3 species having gone extinct or functionally extinct since the beginning of fisheries management in our country. This is primarily due to the fact that they often suffer from a lack of demographic and life history information for extensive part of their range for many systems. This has resulted in a misalignment of conservation and objectives and management outcomes, undetected collapse of stocks or populations, and discovery of populations pushed near to extirpation while declines have gone unnoticed. This is quite readily recognized, in scientific literature. Back in 2005, they wrote a pretty lengthy, long, drawn-out paper outlining across America for pretty much every group of catastoma or sucker what these problems were, and dams, water quality, and life history information was on there. We're still facing these issues across the country as a field fisheries management today. So we're almost 2 decades later, and we're a little further ahead, and we're starting to get steam rolling, but we're still pretty darn close to where we were 20 years ago. Now, like most states, our actively managed fishes have been limited more or less to the game fish species, or species that kind of, quote, pay the bills. As a result of this focus, we've created a bias against rough fish. However, fishing regulations involving rough fish haven't been, a new topic. The history kind of goes back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. Evolved, a highly variable array of different laws and regulations, even within Minnesota. And this is just an example on the left-hand side there of, kind of how we've progressed through things up until about, 2003. More recently, we've instituted a bag limit on gar, which is in the past. But, the history even goes further than this. The Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior calls the February full moon the sucker moon, right? So this value ties before European expansion and still continues. In addition to this, the term rough fish, while synonymous with trash fish, junk, throw them on the bank for many people, that's not actually the definition of what a rough fish was. It was fish that were sold in the rough. So just gutted and left scaled whole body and sold. So these fish were fish that had value. It was more about the preparation style and not so much about what you were supposed to do with them, whether or not it was sale or junk. To put this in perspective, walleye were not popular until the 40s and 50s. There were a large group of the country that considered them kind of a junk rough fish. And more recently, flathead catfish or catfish in general, up until the early 90s, were considered a rough fish and less loved. Look at them now. They're one of the most popular sport fish in the country. And a lot of management is devoted towards maintaining catfish populations. This is something that, many individuals are starting to appreciate the management of these species, like the early 90s for catfish or the 40s and 50s for walleye and sauger. So we're starting to see a paradigm shift, and to be honest, I'm quite happy to say that Minnesota is kind of on the bleeding edge of this paradigm shift. We're setting the pace for most of the country, with the exceptions of maybe Illinois and Oklahoma, which have also put in some regulations on gar. A lot of states, such as Wisconsin, are really kind of looking to us to see what we're going to do. So species of rough fish have gained considerable attention in recent years. For example, bow fishing interest has greatly increased for buffalo and other sucker species. Angling a red horse, which Corey's going to talk about in a little bit, has become a much more popular fish to fish for. Many rough fish enthusiasts or not native, quote, non-game fish enthusiasts and fishing managers alike now recognize and promote that rough fish who have value, increasingly embrace that native fishes like these rough fish I picture here deliver critical ecosystem services, either as bait or forage or ecological indicators. They have long life histories that warrant protection, and the attitude towards them are generally shifting in the public. The DNR has increased our rough fish presence in our outreach. We're reminding anglers that it's okay, quote, okay to put rough fish back in the water, that you do not have to harvest them in one fashion or another. And we've even done the recent unthinkable, and a red horse was placed on the cover of the 22 regulations book. And we're currently working through the process of establishing harvest regulations for the vast majority of Minnesota's rough fish, which is going to be pretty, lack of a better term, first in the nation to kind of do this. So very encouraging on if you love rough fish and particularly suckers. So a little about Redhorse, part of the Moxostoma genus. That's the group. Everything belongs to that. It is a red horse. It also contains, I believe, the hair-lipped suckers. It's the second most speciose genre of suckers. There's 22 species. The next largest group or genre would be the Catastomus genus, which contains 26 species. That genus includes the white sucker, which many of you might be familiar with for spearing. These two genuses make up more than 50% of all suckers. So you're talking red horse are a very large group within that. They reach ages of 30 plus, so they're really old. They mature relatively early, between 2 and 5 years of age, and egg production is somewhere between about 1,000 and 4,400 eggs. So they're relatively fecund, so for their size, and have almost no parental care. And they're also they migrate to spawn, so they may not, the juveniles do not necessarily live where the adults would be, so kind of makes parental care a little difficult. In Minnesota, we have 6 species. They can kind of be split into more or less two groups for red horse: the red-tailed red horse and the black-tailed red horse. The red-tailed red horse are made up of shorthead, greater, and river red horse. The black-tailed red horse are made up of the black red horse, which is Corey alluded to. Some call the dusky red horse because it's not exactly black. It's kind of more of a grayish brown washed out color. The golden red horse, which can get a kind of a goldeny look, or silver red horse, which can also have a goldeny silver look. Typical ways to separate these out, one into the two groups of based off their tail color. Then it typically goes off of mouth parts, where they're living, mouth shape, mouth structure, dorsal fin shape. So you can see on some of them, like the shorthead red horse, you kind of have that swooping look, which would be called a concave or marginated dorsal fin, versus like the greater red horse or the river red horse. They have a convex fin or straight fin typically. So they're trying to separate it out. However, not all of them are doing well. Typically, we think of the shorthead, golden, and silver, and I can even lump the greater as doing relatively okay as far as what we have for information. However, the river red horse and the black red horse, which I'm going to highlight today, are ones that are of more concern. Still lack quite a lot of information, but are more concern. With both having been historically listed as SGCN, or species of greatest conservation need, and the black red horse is currently still state listed and the species of greatest conservation need. If you're not familiar with what that is, species of greatest conservation need are defined as native animals, non-game and game, whose populations are rare, declining, or vulnerable to decline, and are below levels desirable to ensure long-term health and sustainability. But it also includes species for which Minnesota has a stewardship responsibility, which I'm not really sure what they mean by stewardship responsibility exactly, but I had to take a reasonable guess. That would be species that exist within Minnesota almost exclusively. Like we have them here and we're kind of the bulk of the population. So we have a responsibility to keep them still here since they were here before us. The black red horse, on the right-hand side for the next two slides, I have a kind of a map of the different river basins, and then the white dots on there, there's very few for the black red horse, are where we kind of find, or locations we would find them, but with unvouchered specimens, so they haven't been sent off to an ichthyologist to verify that it is in fact a black red horse. It's just suspected, or most likely is. The red dots being a voucher specimen, so confirmed either genetic analysis or by an ichthyologist. What you see on here is there's 3 dots. We have very little information. They probably exist elsewhere. So you're talking the Mississippi River and its larger tribs, something like the Roots, the Zumbro Cannon River down in the southeastern store, where you would find them. They prefer high gradient streams with permanent flow, streams of gravel, rock bottoms, low silt and sediment. However, they may overwinter in the deeper pools of these small systems. They scatter eggs with no parental care, like most suckers. They have a 16-year age maximum. Again, caveat on that, we have very little information. So currently we think they get up to 16 years of age. And they can be difficult to separate out from golden red horse at smaller sizes. They look very similar, like a lot of red horses do. In addition to that, they are threatened, mainly because of the habitat type they use. They are prone to water quality issues, and they have very specific habitat type. And that's pretty ubiquitous across their range. If you look at the states that have them along the Mississippi, they're pretty much not doing well. River red horse is a little bit better of a situation. We have a lot more voucher specimens and a lot more samples. Those ones that are kind of up in the Red River, those are probably actually misidentified. To my knowledge, the river red horse do not exist in the Red River Basin. Those were probably misidentified shorthead red horse, which we will talk about how easy that is to do later on in this presentation. So can't fault anybody who misid'd those ones up there. And I should note that each point isn't one fish. They could be multiple occurrences. It's just general locations where they're found. But these fish occupy swift water over clean gravel, boulders, rubble, and deep water, typically in larger rivers. Small individuals may prefer the shallow pools or backwaters. Habitat alteration is the primary threat to the status due to very rigid habitat requirements, or apparent habitat requirements, needing bouldery cobble with flow over rivers. Where we're at, that's pretty much bank revetments and wing dams. There isn't a whole lot of large cobble with flow over it in the Mississippi, in our section of the river. And to be quite frank, it's kind of how it is throughout much of the Mississippi Basin. They're not doing that well. They're considered typically vulnerable or threatened throughout much of their range. Adults occupy swift water. They spawn much in the same fashion as the black red horse do. They get old, 15 years of age. They can get quite big, almost 9 pounds or 30 inches. So you're talking a pretty nice fish to catch on the line that's going to throw quite a bit of fight. Spawning occurs in the spring, so that's when a lot of people try to target them, when temperatures are between 64 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Their food resources are also sensitive. They feed off of bivalve mollusks, snails, crustaceans, which are quite often the first forage base to go when you have water quality issues, because they're often quite sensitive. In fact, we've limited the harvest of bivalve mussels in the state quite a while ago, but you used to be able to commercially harvest them. We've removed that capability because of declining populations of mussels in the state. In general, their numbers have declined since the 1920s, and a very broad-based estimate of population size based off of federal data is somewhere between 2,500 and 1 million. So not overly useful population estimate, but kind of stresses the need for further information. What I'm currently working on is an identification of key metrics, or metrics that would be useful to positively identifying river red horse versus some of the other species. This project really started out as a status assessment to kind of fill in those information gaps I've been talking about. It's hard to put regulations or determine if regulations are working if you don't know how fast fish are growing, what size they get to, how long they live, how fecund they are, what their mortality rate is. Are we losing 50% of individuals each year? Are we having recruitment that equals 50% of loss, or is it zero? However, the first step to that is you need to be sure of what you're IDing, which I thought would be easy because I have taxonomic keys and I've seen a handful. But when I started looking at this, there's actually inconsistency in the keys, and there's lack of evaluation and metrics used to identify these species. For example, I broke out 2 different books, one for Wisconsin, and I believe the other one was for Illinois. I took the same fish and I worked through the fish key right down through, with the exception of the metric that would require me to kill the fish. And I came out with a shorthead red horse based off one book and a river red horse based on the other book. I did this for a handful of other fish, and sometimes they would agree and other times they would not. This key would also, that I'm showing on the screen here, also agreed and didn't agree depending on what you're in. And that really shouldn't happen. You would hope to pull up a book, and depending on what state you are, and come back with basically the same results, especially with states that share the same fish, like Wisconsin, Illinois, and Minnesota, and share boundaries. But they don't, and this can be problematic. So I quickly said, all right, well, the first step would be to get genetically confirmed fish and determine what would be the most useful way to identify these fish. And again, it's hard to manage species if you can't identify them as a biologist or a field, let alone trying to have anglers identify them to follow the regulations. You can't expect the anglers to follow the regulations if we can't even ID them. Now, based off this picture I'm showing you, this key, you're like, well, that's pretty easy. That looks not so bad. The mouth parts look different. The fins look different. You're telling me there's different counts and different, fin rays or scales or whatever here. You throw the fish up there together and, you put them next to each other and suddenly you're like, well, to me, I can tell the difference. But the general angler, if that's the first time you've seen one or, the first 24 times you've seen them, they're going, well, that's the same fish. Kind of becomes a little more difficult. Maybe you say the greater red horse and the river red horse have a bit of a different head shape, but you might dismiss that. But other than that, it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. Another main metric that you'll see is mouth shape, right? Kind of looks similar, different here. The short head's got that straight. There's kind of a divot here in the greater and the river red horse. In addition to this, it's not noted on this key, is the presence of plicate or supplicate. So the left-hand side would be a fish that has plicate lips or these smooth folds. And the right-hand side, B, would be something that would be supplicate, or something that has basically those folds with a break in the middle. Shorthead red horse are expected to be supplicate, and river red horse are expected to be plicate. However, this is also problematic based off of the research I'm currently working on. Here I have a figure from some work I'm working on. These are all from the shorthead red horse, different ones. Top side is individuals whose mouths are both plicate and possess papillae, or supplicate is another way of terming it. B are individuals whose mouths are plicate but do not possess papillae or are not supplicate. All of those fish should be supplicate. The other thing you're going to notice some of them look like they have straight bottoms of mouth. Some look like they have notches. None of them are that nice, neat, uniform look that you would expect from a shorthead red horse if you're looking at that nice image there in the top. So again, not as easygoing as one would think, and maybe not as consistent as you would expect based off a key. So I took a whole bunch of measurements on a bunch of different fish throughout the river. Things like fin ray counts, head length, body length, scale counts along the body around the caudal peduncle, which is that position A on there. And I took some ratios of things like head length to body length, or head length to dorsal base, which is B on that marker, and try to figure out if there were more consistent metrics we could use, or a weight of evidence approach would be. So like, can I get like dorsal fin ray count is typically this, and head size is typically this, and head size ratio against body length is typically this. If 2 of them say shorthead red horse and 1 says river red horse, I'm going to call it a shorthead red horse. If they all say the same thing, obviously I'm going to call that species, but using multiple things to try to ID these out rather than one alone, which may be problematic. So simply put, and hopefully you guys will be able to identify shortheads versus river red horse, because that's really where it's problematic. The graders are a little easier. They have a one less fin ray on their pelvic, and they have a larger scale count around their colobeduncle, and their head looks more like a block relative to the other two species. But the two that are hard, shorthead versus river red horse, there are some differences, but still problematic relative to the literature. So on the left, the y-axis is the percent individuals that have that trait. The solid color would be indicating not supplicate. So in this case, river red horse, none of them were supplicate. That's what we would want. Cool. All river red horse, not supplicate. It doesn't have, it's plicate, it's not a river red horse. However, for shorthead red horse, about 20% are also not supplicate. When they, according to literature, they should all be supplicate. So potentially, as a field across the country, if you're only basing it off the mouth plicate or not, and again, to remind you, that's what that looks like. A is not supplicate, and B is supplicate. We could theoretically call up to 20% of these shortheads river red horses, which becomes problematic because shortheads are super abundant and river red horse are not doing well. So we could be artificially boosting, as a field ubiquitously across the country, the counts of, or the assumption that the populations are doing better than they are by misidentification. Continuing on to looking at dorsal fin shape, and this is kind of messy, but again, percent that are having the category or shape of the dorsal fin on the Y, on the X is the two species. The different patterns in each of these would represent the different types of dorsal fin shape that you have. What we would expect for a river is it to not have what I have on that highlight box on the left-hand side. So you would not expect them to be concave, straight, or concave. You would expect them to have a convex, like the image right below the blocks there, or straight fin. So you're calling roughly about 10% are not what you expect. For shortheads, it's a bit more. Roughly 20% are convex or convex straight, when they should have a concave or concave straight, also termed a marginate dorsal fin. So based off that, you could be misidentifying up to 10% of river red horse as shortheads, or 20% of shortheads as river if you're only using the dorsal fin. Now, if you use both of those in conjunction with each other, you're probably going to be much more accurate. You're probably going to be pretty close. If it doesn't have papillae or is not supplicate and it has a straight or convex dorsal fin, you could be pretty confident that is going to be a river red horse. Moving on, really, when you start looking at ratios of things, standard length, which is just the tip of the nose to the base of where the tail would start, ratio against dorsal fin, the head size, or the head versus dorsal base, really the only two things that come out as useful would be, on average, come out useful is the ratio of head to standard length or dorsal base to head. And again, that little Latin U or Greek U with the little hat over it just means average, so the average value. So for shorthead river red horse, you would expect the head to go into the body less than 5 times. And for shortheads, you would expect it to go in 5 times or greater. So if you have a fish, its head goes into its body 5 times or more, that has papillae or supplicate, and has a concave or straight dorsal fin, you can say within a margin of error, you're basically 100% positive it's a shorthead red horse. If it's not supplicate and its head doesn't go into its body 5 times, you can be pretty confident that you have a river red horse. And that's how I would identify these. And again, just for reference, we're talking about F going into what would essentially be the distance of C there, or not C, well, the line going down the middle of the fish from the head to the tail. With that said, we are looking to do other research, and there are other researchers doing work in the state. The next step after that, in my opinion, would be to get back to the demographic study, that we can have positive IDs, look at the genetics to determine the potential for inbreeding and effective population size off genetics. Those are the other aspects I'm working for to try to get a status assessment on how these fish are currently doing, particularly the river red horse. With that, if you have any questions, right here's my email, and I will toss it over to Corey to continue on and talk about the fun part, fishing.
Thanks, Devon. Okay. Here we go. So my name is Corey Geving. I'm an avid Minnesota redhorse angler and co-founder of the website roughfish.com, which is devoted to the appreciation and pursuit of I like to call them the non-traditional sport fishes, but it's redhorse, other types of suckers, gar, bowfin, fish like that. And I caught my first redhorse when I was about 8 or 10 years old at St. Croix State Park, and it kind of changed my life. Up until that time, I'd only caught little tiny sunfish and bass, and hooking into a fish that was big enough to strip line off my reel and pull so hard it almost pulled me off the beach really lit a fire in me for catching these fish. And since then, I've gone on and I've caught all 6 species in Minnesota and a couple of redhorse species in other states, and it's been a lifelong pursuit of mine. So this presentation is just going to be about simple ways to catch redhorse and why you should do it. So why fish redhorse? Like I said, they're hard fighting fish. They're really beautiful, and they're fun to catch. It's often not unusual to catch fish over 4 or 5 pounds, which is kind of rare to be able to catch that many big fish in an outing. They also live in a lot of beautiful, pristine waterways. Like Devon said, because they feed on mussels and need clean water, you're often visiting some really beautiful places. Thirdly, it's a very simple type of fishing. You don't need a big boat. You don't need a big truck to tow your boat. You don't need a lot of fancy equipment. So because of that, they're available to everyone. They're a great eating fish, and they're an American original. I've guided a lot of anglers from overseas that come over here from Europe, and while we've got walleye, they've got the same basic fish in the zander, pike, salmon, trout are all identical, but the redhorse is something that's only found here in America. So it's really a special catch for people. Like I mentioned, the methods are very simple. Usually it's fishing stationary on the bottom with a natural bait in moving water. Now, if you want to get alternative, you can also use float fishing, drift fishing, fly fishing for them can be done, and ice fishing. But those are a lot harder and more challenging. And I'm mainly going to focus on just the simple bottom fishing with natural baits here. Now you can see the different rigs that I like to use, and it's basically matching the weight to the current speed and water depth. So in the upper left, you've got a split shot rig for shallow water and slower current. In the middle, you've got a moderate weight for moderate depth and current speed. Lower left, you've got heavy weights for where you're really in heavy current and deep water. And then on the far right, I've got what's called a slinky rig, which is a snag-free sinker. You can buy these at good bait and tackle shops or make them yourself, and that just prevents your bait from getting, or your weight from getting caught in the rocks. Now you notice these hooks I've got here are circle hooks. Those are hooks that have the point bent in towards the shank of the hook. I like to use these for redhorse because it really does a good job of hooking them in the lip, so it does minimal damage to the fish. That gives you the opportunity to release the fish unharmed more of the time. So I encourage people to use these. They work great on redhorse, and they do help reduce damage to the fish. For baits, it's worms, and more worms. Obviously, some people prefer red worms, others prefer night crawlers, but there are optional baits that you can use. Raw shrimp is a really good one, especially for some of the bigger red horses like the river and greater. Grocery store mollusks. Like Devon said, there's a moratorium on harvesting native mussels, but you can buy mussels frozen in the grocery store. Squid is also another alternative. You can get that at Asian grocery stores a lot of the time. Artificial scented baits like gulp bait, paste baits can be useful. And then, like I mentioned before, artificial lures and flies. Sometimes it's a very challenging thing to get them on artificials, but there are certain times and places where it can really work, and it's a really fun fish to tangle with on a fly rod. Other considerations, the bank sticks. It's sometimes people think that you're leaning your rod on this stick because you're lazy or you don't want to hold the rod. It's actually a bite detection system, and it's very effective. So when the red horse with its kind of delicate mouth picks up a bait, it's a very light bite. So you need your the fishing rod to be completely stationary and stable, which is why you'll lean it on a bank stick, and you can buy a bank stick for a couple of bucks at a bait shop. Other things you might want to bring are a landing net for easy fish handling and release, cooler of ice for keeping fish and bait cool, measuring tape for bragging rights, and bring a kid fishing. One thing I like to point out is that red horse are totally kid-safe fishes. They're unlike sunfish, perch, bass, bullheads, catfish that have spines that can poke a kid in the hand and ruin their day, and fish like pike and walleye that have teeth. Red horse are completely safe to handle, and kids can really get a lot of confidence from learning good fish handling skills by going red horse fishing. The action can be fast, and also since it's typically done from shore, if the kids get bored, they can run off down the bank and find something else to do. So the seasonality of red horse fishing, there's basically 4 periods that are of most interest. They are spring spawners. So in the springtime period, they migrate upstream and they congregate in big numbers on gravel riffles. So you can often walk along a stream bank and look out and see 1,000 fish out there packed together. One thing I would caution against, though, is trying to cast at those visible spawning fish. They'll often be packed up in really shallow water with their fins sticking out. And you may think you're about to catch 1,000,000 fish, but they rarely bite when they're actually in the act of spawning. Something to remember is that they are drop back spawners. So they like to feed and rest in deeper water above or upstream of the spawning riffle, and then they drop back in groups of 3 with 1 female and 2 males into the spawning area. They spawn, and then once they're done with that, they'll return upstream to do more feeding and resting. So if you see a big group of spawning red horse, just look for some deep water. It might be only 10 or 20 yards upstream, and you may not see fish there, but they will be there, and you'll catch a lot of them. They also bite steadily throughout the summer, and that's often in downstream areas, areas with good current, rocks, sometimes over sand. And then in the fall, so from October until freeze up, there's an incredible downstream migration where the fish go for wintering holes in deeper water. This fish here, my brother caught on Halloween just a few days ago. And basically they keep biting until freeze up, when you can't. You could probably catch them through the ice if there was safe ice. And then there is another period of activity in the very early spring, like Devon mentioned. The month of February in Ojibwe is called Namebini Gizis, which is the suckerfish moon, because red horse and other suckers stage before the spawn, often under the ice at the mouths of tributary streams. And I have friends in Canada that have got this pattern down to a T, and they catch a lot of red horse through the ice in February and March. I haven't figured out how to do this yet, but it's something I'm really trying to figure out. You need to find a lake or a slow area where a tributary stream dumps into a lake, and then fish the mouth. So I'm going to do just a couple of seconds on each of these fish, just pointing out some angling points. This is the shorthead red horse. You can see it's found almost everywhere The one thing is it's got a very tiny mouth, so you have to use the correct hook size. 6 to 10 is best for these. If you're using a bigger hook, and I have fish right next to people that they get bite after bite after bite and can't catch a fish, and it's usually shortheads, and they're using a number 2 or number 4 hook. These are one of the smaller species. They are usually between 1.5 pounds and 2.5 pounds in weight. Golden redhorse, another very common fish found in small waters. They can also be found in the Mississippi and some of the bigger rivers, but they do get down to creek level streams. They're typically 2 to 3 pounds. And something that's interesting about this redhorse is that they tend to leap when hooked. It's amazing how many times I've hooked a fish, had it jump, thrash, and leap out of the water, and then found out it was a golden. So it's something to keep in mind when you're fishing them. They're really fun fish to catch. The silver redhorse, that Halloween fish was another silver redhorse, by the way. This is a larger fish. It averages 3 to 4 pounds, but it's commonly seen as 7 or 8. The spring spawning runs are amazing. They're found throughout the state, and they're an extremely strong fighting fish. They've got this big, broad, slab-sided body, and they are typically caught in current. So this one will really put a bend in your rod and give you a good fight. This is the greater redhorse, the largest of the redhorse. It can reach 15 plus pounds. This is my favorite. They're just amazing fish. They're just incredible battlers. They're beautiful. They often occur in very small streams and also in lakes, which is really interesting. So more research is needed about this fish. Here's the river redhorse. This is one of Devon's research targets. This is a fish that lives in heavy current. It feeds on hard-shelled things like clams and crayfish. It's got crushing teeth in the back of its throat that it uses to crush small clams. It's got a big head and a large mouth. You can see this one in particular. You can really tell the difference between the head size compared to the body size on this fish versus on this short head, where you can see how small and short this head is compared to the body size. So this is a large fish. In some states, they've been recorded up to 12 pounds. And like I mentioned before, they can be caught on mussels and clams you can buy from the grocery store. They're mainly on the border, so the Mississippi here and then the St. Croix, and they are found in like the Kettle and the Mississippi up to St. Anthony Falls. Last is the black or dusky redhorse. The ichthyologists have decided that they wanted to try to emphasize that it's not black, it's more of a dusky color. You can see this fish is a very long, skinny redhorse. It's got smaller scales than the other ones. So there's more scales along the lateral line. That's the easiest way to identify them. They got a very limited range. Place where they've been reliably encountered is in a little bit of the Zumbro and then the Root River down here. And they're essentially found in what you would call an Ozark type setting. And if you go south of here, the next place where there's good numbers of them is in southern Missouri in the Ozarks. So they are really an isolated population up here. And they're a species of special concern here in Minnesota. Just a quick thing about the recipes. I personally make ground fish patties out of them. You can either pan fry or deep fry them. Essentially, you grind the fish up, mix it with some breadcrumbs and an egg, and then fry it. And what happens is the little intramuscular bones that everyone worries about get cut into little pieces, and then the hot frying oil makes them dissolve. So you still get the calcium from eating all those bones, but you can't feel or notice that there were bones in the fish. People also pickle them, smoke them, and score them. Scoring is just cutting through the fillets a bunch of times in parallel cuts, and then when you fry them again, the bones dissolve. You can also cut the lower section of the fillet is boneless, so you can use that for boneless type fillet and then score or grind the rest of it. or you can just eat around the bones. I know I don't like any kind of fish that has bones in it, but it's kind of a cultural thing. There are many cultures where they eat saprinid fishes, with bones in them, and they don't find it a problem. So it's whatever you prefer. Last little bit, conservation, obviously only take what you can use, practice catch and release. I like to use circle hooks if possible to avoid deep hooking the fish. I keep a soft net to control the fish and keep them in the water as opposed to thrashing about on shore. And it's a good idea to limit your take of the river grader and black red horse. I like to, I personally wouldn't keep any of those three for food. I try to focus most of my harvest on goldens and shortheads. Occasionally we'll eat a silver. One thing to be aware of though is the illusion of abundance, where when you, especially in the spring, when you see a spawning aggregation of red horse, like in this picture, you can see there, it's kind of difficult to see, but there's several hundred red horse on this spawning shoal. It looks like there are an inexhaustible supply of them, but because they're so highly migratory, this might represent all the fish for a 50-mile stretch of river. So just because you see a lot of them in a spot doesn't mean that there's an inexhaustible supply. Oh, and by the way, it's also one of the few fishes that you can observe without catching them. In the springtime, if you like bike or hike the Root River State Trail in southern Minnesota by Lanesboro, you can often go up and down the river and just see these aggregations of fish that outside of Alaska, I haven't seen anything like this anywhere. So it's really it's a spectacle of nature. So with that, thank you. You can email me. I've got my email right there, corey.geving@state.mn.us. And I think the idea is to open it up to questions now.
Hey, great presentation. Oh, somebody's got their speaker on a little bit. If have you turn that down for me? A little feedback there. Yeah, I did want to call everybody's attention in the chat there. There's a couple links put in there. One to roughish.com. Corey, you also joined us for another webinar, episode 53, on just fishing for rough fish. That had some great information, and people want to explore a little bit more on the fishing side of that. So please check those out if you want to. Got a couple questions coming in. If anybody else does have some questions, please put them in the Q&A function. Again, if you can't find that, 3 little ellipses in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there, we'll open that up for you. A couple for Devon here. John asked, if these species are this hard to positively identify, do you have any idea why one is faring so much better in our current environment?
Yeah, some of them are just more sensitive, right? And it goes back to, like, think about the food for the river red horse, right? That's a sensitive food type to begin with. So if there's no food, those fish start to disappear. I think in general, though, we as a field fisheries manager, and not just Minnesota, across the board, we don't really have a good picture. So we say they're doing well, but as Corey alluded to, they do aggregate. And with any gear we have in fisheries, we have the problem of what's called hyperstability, where if you target things that aggregate, and that's when usually you can catch them, they can overwhelm your gear. So you can get this appearance that everything's doing really well, right? It's because there's just so many, you can't catch her anymore. And they just keep looking like they're doing well and doing well until they're not. That I'm saying that's happening here, but it's one possible answer across the range in which they seemingly are doing so much better than others because we just haven't seen the collapse yet in some of these systems. That said, we're also improving the environment, pretty much ubiquitously across the board for stream and river health compared to, certainly 100 years ago, and even more, less so 30 years ago. So things are getting better. So we're starting to see, revival of some of those species. Things like the river red horse, I'm not sure how abundant they ever were. We may have actually increased their abundance historically by adding all those wing dams and revetments because they do like that rocky habitat, which I suspect was probably not overly numerous in this part of the country to begin with. A lot of moving around of sediments. Unknown, but that would be my best answer. It would be a lack of information, so a perceived doing better, and then really dependent on the food type they have, and then I think the last thing would be the environments they're living in. Things that are living in small streams, they don't have a lot of buffering capacity to like environmental degradation. So things that are in river, it takes a lot more environmental degradation to cause an issue for a population. That said, things that are in rivers are also have a tendency to also use tributaries, so there's a little bit more buffering capacity to problems. So they can get into some of those tributaries and still have recruitment, versus something that's a stream obligate or small tributary, obligate. They pretty much have nowhere to go because they're at the end point, right? It's the headwaters or more headwaters, or they go out to the big river, which they don't like. So that would be my short answer, as short as I can make it.
Great, thank you for that. Sue asked a question, Corey, about lead-free sinkers. I know we always try to do the stewardship thing here. Do you get any good tips on finding lead-free sinkers? I know sometimes they get to be a little hard to find.
Yeah, and I apologize. Those photos I gave you, I took those about 15 or 20 years ago. So there was a lot of lead in there, and I should probably replace those photos with some good tungsten weights. Yeah, you can find different kinds of steel or tungsten weights in good tackle shops, or order them online. It's always a good idea to try to use non-toxic weights whenever possible. And the slinky weight that I use, you can use, it was traditionally lead in those, but you can also manufacture those with steel. So either steel shot or steel ball bearings, or buy them in the tackle shops. They make a tungsten drop shot weight that's like a cylindrical piece of tungsten with a swivel on top that I found is really fantastic for red horse fishing. And you can buy those on Amazon or Cabela's, or I think Shields Outdoors might have them. I'm not sure. Does that help?
Yeah, check out your local tackle shop and see what you can find there. So
yeah, and if they don't carry it, ask for it. A lot of those shops won't carry it unless they know there's a demand for it. So
yeah, that's a good point. What type of line are you using typically, Corey, and how heavy? Are you a mono guy or?
Yeah, I'm a mono guy, but I know a lot of people prefer braid. I like an 8-pound line is about my perfect weight. A lot of people like a 10 or 12-pound braid too, but I find the monofilament it holds knots really well, and the fish don't seem to notice it much. But they can be sensitive to a really heavy line, so I don't think I would go over, like 12. I think a 12-pound line would be a little too heavy for my taste.
If you're fly fishing, also fluorocarbon all the way. They nylon or non-fluorocarbon leaders, they spot pretty much immediately. You need something that's going to be as invisible as possible. So if you're fly fishing, yeah, the nylon, some of the other types, there are a couple other materials now. They have more give and stretch, which is nice because these fish are very powerful. I mean, one of the only fish, I swear to God, look me in the eyes and then go, aha, and then snap my leader was a sucker. So having that stretch is kind of nice sometimes, but they are very sensitive to things in the water, and they will see a heavy line, or if you're fly fishing a non-fluorocarbon line.
Devon, you're being a fly angler also. What type of flies are you using, and what type of year are you catching red horse on?
So it's around the same period, but it's a bit more difficult. As Corey alluded to, things that have scent and look tasty because they're natural are much easier. When you're fly fishing for suckers, and a lot of my experience is not in the States, elsewhere, because I spent a lot of time outside the state. It's pretty similar though. Is your sight fishing? So you're getting something that has a bit of high visibility, that looks a little bit like what they would eat, that's got some some hairiness to it. So like a balanced leech that you can drift down to something that's a dropper rig sometimes works. So having a heavy nymph below some sort of a dry fly, would work. And then milty eggs, anything that you can kind of drift down that has high vis with a little bit of fluff coming off it to kind of wave. But you kind of have to anticipate when they're feeding, throwing out in front of them, and then having it drop down and drift right in front of their face. So it is quite a bit of a challenge to do, but it is quite a lot of fun. And after this, I did miss Mary's question, so I would like to answer that next.
Yeah, go ahead. Mary had a little bit of difficulty with her video and audio, it sounds like, but her question.
So the genetics part right now, what we've done it for is to do tests for what's called an F1 hybrid, which would be first generation hybrid. If shortheads, graders, or rivers have intermixed. That's done through something called microsatellite analysis. It can only go back one generation. So far, we've had no hybrids, which is nice, right? So we can be pretty sure that these are segregated species. We don't have to worry about that, like, oh, what happens when they interbreed yet. The next step would be to do something called SNPs, which gives you a better resolution via basically more data. It's more expensive, but that gets you at things like inbreeding. So it can say, all right, how many of these individuals are brothers and sisters? Like, i.e., we're not getting new recruitment. We're not getting a lot of migratory movement or exchange with other systems or between pools, which becomes problematic. That would be if you have a high hybridization or high inbreeding rate, that would be indicative of, oh, if things collapse here, there's really nothing that's going to help us. In addition to that, you can also get what's called effective genetic population size, which is a kind of a general number of, and again, it's all relative, of how well it's doing. You know, a better effective genetic population size means your population's healthier. Really low ones means that you're doing really bad. And there is some methods. They have really wide, what's called confidence limits or uncertainty in the value, so wide range of potential values for population estimates by reversing that number, using that effective population size with some best guesstimates of what's there. So that's kind of the next steps, and using those latter pieces of information kind of as a first goal of a status assessment of how well the populations are doing. Next step would be to take bony structures, fin rays, oilets, which are little bone structures in their head, because fish, when they grow, they lay rings on their bony structures like trees would that coordinate with seasonal changes. So you can get ages, so I can get age, and maturity, growth, mortality rates by year, and that would be the next step, as well as evaluation of regulations that we might be potentially putting in on them and their potential effectiveness.
Awesome. It's really cool you guys are doing all this research on some of these species of fish that we have historically just kind of left by the wayside. So it's really cool that you guys are diving into this and finding more information. We're always learning something about this, so we really appreciate that. I think we're just about out of time, so if anybody has any last minute questions, we only got about a minute left here. Put that in the Q&A. I want to remind everybody, next week, again, these are every Wednesday we do these. Next week, we're going to talk about fall birding and photography tips. So May is going to join us for that one, and the Urban Bird Collective is going to join us, talk a little bit about fall birding across Minnesota and taking some pictures of that. So everybody's supposed to be super nice, pretty nice weekend, and even nicer next week, getting a little warmer. So hopefully you got some good tips today, and you can get out there and enjoy a little bit of open water season yet this fall. Enjoy the nice weather. So thanks everybody for joining us. Corey and Devon, fantastic job today. We appreciate it. Thank you for joining us.